The whir of a ceiling fan. The click of a front door latch. The sound of keys hitting a kitchen counter. These are the kinds of sounds that mark the end of an ordinary day, the sounds you probably heard in your own home just hours ago. But in Houston, Texas, on the evening of March 14, 1989, those ordinary sounds would be the last ones 29-year-old Angela Marie Dawson would ever make. By morning, she'd be gone. And the question of why, and who, would hang over that city for 15 years. Before we continue with this story, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories travel. Angela Dawson wasn't supposed to be a headline. She was supposed to be someone's coworker on Monday morning. Someone's phone call that weekend. Someone's friend who showed up on time with wine and terrible advice about men. She was a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm downtown, the kind of person who color-coded her calendar and always remembered birthdays. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the Montrose neighborhood, a place she'd moved into just 8 months earlier, proud and a little scared, the way you are when you finally have your own space. Her parents had helped her move in. Her father installed extra locks on the door. Her mother left a casserole in the fridge and a note that said, "Call us when you get lonely." Angela never did get lonely. She loved that apartment. She loved the independence. She loved walking to the corner store on Sunday mornings for coffee and a newspaper, loved the small routines that made her feel like an adult in a city that still felt new. And Houston in 1989 was new for a lot of people. It was growing fast, highways stretching farther every year, subdivisions cropping up on the edges, downtown skyline filling in like a gap-toothed smile. It was a place where you could reinvent yourself if you wanted to. Where nobody asked too many questions. Where you could disappear into the crowd. Or just disappear. Angela had grown up in Beaumont, about 90 miles east of Houston. Small town Texas. The kind of place where everyone knew your family, where your reputation followed you from elementary school straight through graduation. She'd been a good student. Quiet, but not shy. She played clarinet in the high school band. She worked weekends at her uncle's hardware store, learning how to make change and small talk with customers who'd known her since she was 5. After high school, she'd gone to Lamar University, studied business administration, and graduated with decent grades and no clear idea what she wanted to do with her life. That's when Houston started calling to her. It was close enough to visit home, far enough to feel like freedom. Big enough to get lost in. Big enough to become whoever she wanted to be. She moved there in the summer of 1987, 27 years old and ready for something different. She found work as a receptionist first, then moved into a paralegal position at a law firm that specialized in real estate transactions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. It paid well enough. And Angela was good at it, organized, detail-oriented, the kind of employee who stayed late without being asked. Her co-workers liked her. She was the one who brought donuts on Fridays, who remembered to water the office plants, who would cover your shift if you needed to leave early. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she was reliable. And in a busy law office, reliability meant everything. Outside of work, Angela was building a life. She joined a book club at a local library. She took a pottery class on Thursday evenings. She started jogging in the mornings before work, looping through the neighborhood, headphones on, trying to shed the 10 pounds she'd been carrying since college. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious. Nothing that lasted. Until Kyle. March 14th was a Tuesday. Angela had worked late, not unusual for her. The firm was preparing for a big case, and she'd volunteered to stay and organize files. She left the office around 7:30, waved goodnight to the security guard in the lobby, and drove home in her white Honda Civic. Neighbors later said they saw her pull into the parking lot around 8. One woman, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the building next to Angela's, remembered seeing her carrying a bag of groceries and her work tote, fumbling with her keys at the base of the stairs. Mrs. Chen had waved. Angela had waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Angela didn't show up for work the next morning, her boss wasn't immediately worried. She was reliable, yes, but people get sick. People oversleep. The alarm doesn't go off, the car won't start, life happens. But when she didn't answer her phone, and when the receptionist called twice more by noon with no response, someone from the office started to worry. Her supervisor, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, decided to drive over during her lunch break. Patricia had Angela's home address in the employee files. She'd never been to Angela's apartment, but she knew the neighborhood. Montrose was artsy, eclectic, the kind of place where coffee shops stayed open late and people walked their dogs at midnight without worrying. Patricia pulled into the parking lot a little after 1 in the afternoon. She found Angela's building, climbed the outdoor stairs to the second floor, and knocked on apartment 214. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, and called Angela's name through the door. Still nothing. The door was locked. The lights were off. Everything looked normal from the outside. But Angela's car was still in the lot. Patricia had walked right past it. That's when the worry became something sharper. Something cold. Patricia went back down to the leasing office and found the property manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Dan Kowalski. She explained the situation. Angela hadn't shown up for work, wasn't answering her phone, her car was here but she wasn't responding to the door. Could he check on her? Could he use his key? Dan hesitated. He didn't like going into people's apartments without permission. Privacy laws, liability, all of that. But Patricia's concern was genuine, and something about the situation felt off. He agreed to do a welfare check. They climbed the stairs together. Dan knocked first, announced himself, waited. Nothing. He unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Patricia stayed in the doorway while Dan stepped inside. The living room was neat. No signs of struggle. The kitchen was just beyond, and he could see the counter, a bag of groceries sitting there, unpacked. Milk. Bread. A bag of oranges. He called Angela's name. No response. He moved toward the bedroom. And that's when he saw her. Angela was lying on the floor near the foot of the bed, fully clothed in the same outfit she'd worn to work the day before. A black skirt, a cream-colored blouse, pantyhose, sensible heels kicked off near the closet. Her arms were at her sides. Her eyes were closed. She looked, at first glance, like she might be sleeping. But she wasn't sleeping. Dan backed out of the room immediately. He told Patricia not to go in, to stay where she was. He went back downstairs and called 911. Houston police arrived within minutes. The scene was secured. Yellow tape went up. Neighbors started gathering in the parking lot, drawn by the flashing lights, the sudden commotion. Mrs. Chen was there, arms folded across her chest, face tight with worry. She kept saying, "I just saw her last night. I just saw her." Detectives arrived. Crime scene techs. A medical examiner. The apartment became a hive of controlled activity, photographs taken, measurements made, evidence bagged and tagged. But even from the beginning, there was something unsettling about the scene. Not wrong, exactly. Just, quiet. Too quiet. There was no weapon. No signs of forced entry. The lock on the front door was intact. The windows were closed and locked from the inside. Her purse was still on the counter, wallet untouched, $23 in cash still folded neatly inside. Her jewelry, a small gold necklace her grandmother had given her, a pair of silver earrings, was still in a dish by the bathroom sink. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been broken. The apartment looked exactly as it should have, except for the young woman lying dead on the bedroom floor. The medical examiner would later determine that Angela had been strangled. Manually. Someone had used their hands. There were faint bruises on her neck, consistent with sustained pressure. No defensive wounds on her hands or arms. No scratches, no broken nails, nothing to suggest she'd fought back. That detail bothered the investigators. If Angela had been attacked, if someone had grabbed her by the throat, why hadn't she fought? Why hadn't she screamed? The walls in those apartments were thin. You could hear someone's television through the floor, hear footsteps in the hallway, hear a couple arguing 3 doors down. But no one had heard Angela scream. Maybe she didn't have time to. Or maybe she knew the person who killed her. That possibility, that Angela had let someone in, someone she trusted, became the working theory almost immediately. Because if there'd been no forced entry, if she'd opened the door willingly, then the list of suspects was smaller. And more personal. Detectives started with the people closest to her. That's always where you start. You look at the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, the coworker who paid too much attention, the neighbor who watched a little too long. You pull on those threads and see what unravels. Angela had been dating someone. His name was Kyle Brennan. He was 32, worked in sales for a medical supply company, and by all accounts, they'd been together for about 5 months. Not serious, but not casual either. They'd met at a happy hour through mutual friends. He was charming. Good-looking. The kind of man who made a strong first impression. Her friends had liked him at first. Then they weren't so sure. One of Angela's closest friends, a woman named Denise Ruiz, told detectives that Angela had mentioned feeling pressured by Kyle in recent weeks. He wanted to see her more often. He didn't like it when she made plans without him. He'd started showing up at her apartment unannounced. Nothing violent. Nothing illegal. Just insistent. The kind of behavior that makes you uncomfortable but not afraid. Not yet. Angela had told Denise she was thinking about ending things. She just hadn't figured out how. Denise said Angela had called her the Sunday before she died, 2 days before. They'd talked for over an hour. Angela had sounded tired, a little frustrated. She'd said Kyle had gotten upset with her that afternoon over something small, something about plans for the following weekend. He'd wanted her to commit to spending Saturday with him, and she'd said maybe, she wasn't sure yet, she had a lot of work to catch up on. That had been enough to set him off. Not yelling, Denise said, but cold. Withdrawn. The kind of anger that sits heavy in a room. Angela had said she thought she was going to break up with him. She just needed to figure out the right time. Denise told detectives she wished Angela had done it sooner. She wished she'd pushed harder. She wished a lot of things that didn't matter anymore. Kyle Brennan was brought in for questioning on March 16, 2 days after Angela's body was found. He came willingly. He seemed shocked, grief-stricken even. He sat in the interview room with his hands folded on the table, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice shaking when he spoke. He said he'd last seen Angela on Sunday, 2 days before her death. They'd had brunch in the Heights, spent the afternoon together, and he'd dropped her off at her apartment around 6 in the evening. He said they'd argued a little, something about plans for the following weekend, but nothing serious. He said he'd called her Monday night around 9 and left a message on her answering machine, but she hadn't called back. He said he'd figured she was still upset with him, that she needed space. He said he'd planned to call her again Tuesday night. He said he never got the chance. Detectives asked him where he was Tuesday night, the night Angela died. He said he'd been home. Alone. Watching television. He couldn't remember what he'd watched. Some sitcom, maybe. He didn't have an alibi. But he also didn't have scratches, bruises, or any visible injuries. His hands were clean. His demeanor was calm. Cooperative. Maybe a little too calm. They asked if they could search his apartment. He said yes. They didn't find anything. No evidence linking him to the scene. No blood-stained clothing hidden in the back of a closet. No trophy taken from Angela's apartment. No confession waiting to tumble out under pressure. Just a man who said he'd loved Angela and couldn't believe she was gone. And without physical evidence, without a witness, without anything concrete tying him to that apartment on the night she died, there was nothing detectives could do. Kyle Brennan was released. The investigation continued, but it was slow. Detectives interviewed Angela's co-workers, her neighbors, people from her book club and pottery class. They talked to the security guard at her office building, the clerk at the corner store where she bought coffee on Sunday mornings, the woman who taught her jogging group in Memorial Park. Everyone said the same thing: Angela was nice. Quiet. Kept to herself mostly, but friendly enough. No enemies. No drama. No obvious reason for anyone to want her dead. They looked into her finances. No large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, no debts that might suggest she'd gotten mixed up in something dangerous. They looked into her phone records. Calls to her parents, to Denise, to Kyle, to the office. Nothing unusual. They looked into the building's maintenance records. That's when Michael Torres's name came up. Michael Torres was the apartment complex's maintenance man. He was 27 in 1989, quiet, worked odd hours, lived in a small unit in the same complex. He'd been employed there for about 2 years. His job was to fix things: leaky faucets, broken air conditioners, garbage disposals that stopped working. He had keys to every unit, including Angela's. Detectives brought him in for an interview on March 20th, 6 days after Angela's body was found. Michael came in on his lunch break, still wearing his work uniform, a navy blue shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket. He seemed nervous, but not evasive. He answered every question directly. He said he knew who Angela was. He'd done work in her apartment a few times over the past several months. Fixed a garbage disposal that had jammed. Replaced a smoke detector battery. Checked a water leak in the bathroom that turned out to be nothing. He said she'd always been polite. She'd offer him a glass of water, thank him for his time, tip him occasionally even though she didn't have to. He said he thought she was nice. Detectives asked him where he'd been Tuesday night, the night Angela died. He said he'd been working. There'd been a leak in another building, Unit 118. An elderly tenant, Mrs. Patterson, had called the office around 7 saying water was dripping through her ceiling. He'd gone over to check it out, found the problem in the unit above hers, fixed it. Took him about an hour, maybe longer. He couldn't remember exactly. They asked if anyone could confirm that. He said Mrs. Patterson could. And maybe the tenant in the unit above, though he wasn't sure if anyone had been home when he went in. Detectives followed up. Mrs. Patterson confirmed that there had been a leak and that Michael had come to fix it. But she couldn't remember exactly what time. Could have been 7. Could have been 8. She wasn't sure. The tenant in the unit above was out of town and couldn't be reached. It was thin. But it was something. Michael Torres wasn't considered a primary suspect. There was no evidence linking him to Angela's apartment that night. No motive. No history of violence. He was cooperative, transparent, and his story checked out, more or less. Detectives moved on. For Angela's family, the weeks that followed were unbearable. Her father, Robert Dawson, and her mother, Linda, drove to Houston as soon as they'd gotten the call. They'd been told their daughter was dead, that it was a homicide, that the police were investigating. But no one could tell them who had done it or why. They stayed in Houston for 2 weeks, waiting. Hoping for an arrest. Hoping for answers. None came. Robert was a retired electrician, 61 years old, the kind of man who believed in hard work, clear answers, and doing the right thing. He'd spent his whole life fixing problems, rewiring houses, troubleshooting circuits, making things work the way they were supposed to. But this was a problem he couldn't fix. This was a question with no clear answer. And it was killing him. Linda was quieter in her grief. She didn't ask the detectives 100 questions the way Robert did. She didn't demand updates, didn't call the precinct every other day. She just sat in their hotel room and stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring with news that never came. They held a funeral for Angela in Beaumont on March 25, 11 days after her death. It was a small service at the Methodist church where Angela had been baptized as a baby. About 60 people came. Family, mostly. Old friends from high school. A few co-workers from Houston who'd made the drive. Denise was there, her eyes swollen from crying. Patricia from the law office came, sitting in the back pew, hands folded in her lap. Kyle Brennan didn't come. Robert noticed. After the service, after they'd buried Angela in the cemetery on the edge of town, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Robert sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and tried to make sense of what had happened. He couldn't. So he decided he'd find out himself. Robert started keeping a file. He bought a 3-ring binder and a pack of dividers and began organizing everything he could get his hands on: copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, notes from phone calls with detectives, names and addresses of anyone who might have information. He wrote down everything he remembered from conversations with Angela's friends, every detail the police had shared, every unanswered question that kept him awake at night. He made a timeline of Angela's last week. Where she'd been, who she'd seen, what she'd said on the phone. He cross-referenced it with what the police had told him, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that might lead somewhere. Linda watched him do this every night. She didn't try to stop him. She understood. It was the only way he knew how to grieve. By the summer of 1989, the case had stalled. Detectives had followed every lead, interviewed every potential witness, and come up empty. There was no physical evidence linking anyone to the scene. No fingerprints that didn't belong. No DNA, though DNA technology in 1989 was still in its infancy, not yet the investigative tool it would become in later years. The case was filed as unsolved, and the detectives moved on to other cases, other victims, other families waiting for answers. But Robert Dawson didn't move on. He started driving to Houston on weekends. He'd leave Beaumont early Saturday morning and spend the day in Montrose, walking through Angela's old neighborhood, knocking on doors, showing people her photo. "Do you remember her?" he'd ask. "Did you see anything unusual that night?" Most people didn't remember. It had been months by then. Others remembered Angela vaguely, the quiet woman in 214 who smiled when you passed her in the hall, but they hadn't seen anything. Hadn't heard anything. One man, a college student who lived in the building next door, said he'd seen a car parked in the lot that night that didn't usually park there. But he couldn't remember what kind of car. Couldn't remember the color. Couldn't remember if it had been there before or after 8 o'clock. It wasn't much. But Robert wrote it down anyway. He called the Houston Police Department every Monday. Sometimes they'd put him through to the detective assigned to the case. Most times they wouldn't. He'd leave messages. He'd ask if there had been any progress. Any new leads. Anything at all. The answer was always the same: "We're still investigating, Mr. Dawson. We'll let you know if anything develops." By 1990, a year after Angela's death, the calls became less frequent. The detective who'd been working the case had moved to a different division. The file had been reassigned. Then reassigned again. Then it sat on a shelf in the cold case unit, one folder among hundreds, gathering dust. But Robert kept calling. He started placing an ad in the Houston Chronicle every year on the anniversary of Angela's death. It wasn't expensive, just a small notice in the classified section. Angela's name. Her photo. A brief description of what had happened. A plea for anyone with information to come forward. A phone number, Robert's home number, they could call. Most years, no one called. But some years, someone did. Wrong numbers, mostly. Prank calls. Once, a psychic who claimed she could see Angela's spirit and knew who'd killed her. Robert listened patiently, took notes, and when she was done, thanked her and hung up. He never stopped hoping the next call would be the real one. Linda watched her husband disappear into this obsession. She watched him spend weekends in Houston instead of at home. She watched him sit at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, poring over that binder, making notes in the margins, rearranging facts like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. She wanted to tell him to stop. That it was destroying him. That Angela was gone and no amount of investigation would bring her back. But she couldn't say it. Because she understood. Because part of her wanted the same thing. So she let him keep going. And years passed. Houston grew. The city sprawled outward, highways extending like veins, new neighborhoods appearing where there'd been nothing but scrubland. The skyline changed. Buildings rose and fell. The 90s arrived with new technology, new crimes, new cases that demanded attention. Angela's case slipped further into the past. But in Beaumont, in the small house on Maple Street where Robert and Linda Dawson still lived, nothing changed. Angela's bedroom stayed exactly as it had been. The same comforter on the bed. The same stuffed animals on the shelf. The same posters on the wall, Madonna, Michael Jackson, a movie poster for the Breakfast Club. Linda dusted it every week. She washed the sheets even though no one slept in them. She kept the door open so she could see inside when she walked past. Robert still drove to Houston most weekends. By 1995, 6 years after Angela's death, he'd developed his own theories about what had happened. He didn't think it was random. He didn't think it was a stranger. He thought it was someone Angela knew. Someone who'd been in that apartment before. Someone who had access. And he kept coming back to Michael Torres. It wasn't that Robert had evidence. He didn't. But he had a feeling, and that feeling wouldn't go away. Michael had been there, in Angela's apartment, multiple times. He had keys. He knew her schedule. And then, 3 weeks after Angela's death, Michael had quit his job and left Houston. No forwarding address. No explanation. Just gone. Robert thought that was strange. He brought it up with the police. He brought it up with local reporters who'd covered the case. He brought it up with anyone who would listen. But without new evidence, there was nothing anyone could do. Michael Torres had left Texas. He wasn't a fugitive. He wasn't wanted for anything. He was just a man who'd moved. Still, Robert couldn't let it go. By 1998, 9 years after Angela's death, Robert had tracked down an address for Michael Torres. He was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, working construction. Robert wrote him a letter. He didn't accuse Michael of anything directly. He just asked if Michael remembered Angela. If he remembered anything unusual from that time. If he'd be willing to talk. The letter came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender." Robert tried again a year later. Same result. He told Linda that Michael Torres was hiding something. That guilty people run. That innocent people don't refuse to talk. Linda said maybe Michael just wanted to be left alone. That maybe he was tired of being associated with something terrible that he hadn't done. Robert didn't think so. The years stretched on. Angela would have turned 30 in 1990. 35 in 1995. 40 in 2000. Each birthday, Linda baked a cake. She'd put it on the kitchen table and sit there for a while, not eating it, just looking at it. Robert would come in and sit with her. They wouldn't say anything. They'd just sit. And then they'd throw the cake away. In 2001, 12 years after Angela's death, Robert suffered a heart attack. Not a massive one, but enough to land him in the hospital for 3 days. The doctor said he needed to reduce stress. Linda told him he needed to let go of the case. That it was killing him, slowly but surely. Robert said he couldn't. He was released from the hospital with a prescription for blood pressure medication and orders to take it easy. He ignored the second part. Within 2 weeks, he was back at the kitchen table with his binder, back on the phone with the Houston Police Department, back placing his annual ad in the Chronicle. But something had changed. He was tired now. You could see it in the way he moved, the way he spoke. The obsession hadn't faded, but his energy had. He was slowing down, and he knew it. He told Linda one night, lying in bed in the dark, that he was afraid he'd die before he found out what had happened to Angela. Linda didn't say anything. She just reached over and held his hand. And then, in late 2003, 14 years after Angela Dawson was killed, something finally broke. A woman named Brenda Ochoa picked up the phone and called the Houston Police Department. Brenda was 33 years old in 2003. She'd been living in the same apartment complex as Angela back in 1989. She was 19 at the time, working nights at a diner, trying to save money for community college. She'd moved out of the complex in 1991, gotten married, had 2 kids, moved to the suburbs. She had a normal life. A quiet life. But she'd been carrying something for 14 years. She'd seen Robert Dawson's ad in the Chronicle that November. She saw it every year, actually. And every year, she'd think about calling. Every year, she'd talk herself out of it. It had been so long. What she'd seen probably didn't matter. She didn't want to get involved. Didn't want to dredge up the past. But in 2003, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She told detectives that on the night Angela died, she'd been coming home from her shift around 10:30. She'd parked in the lot and was walking toward her building when she saw someone leaving Angela's apartment. A man. He was moving quickly, head down, hands shoved in his pockets. She didn't get a good look at his face, but she recognized him. It was Michael Torres. She said she'd thought it was odd at the time. Michael didn't usually work that late, and she hadn't seen a work truck in the lot, but she'd been tired, and it hadn't seemed like her business. The next day, when she heard Angela was dead, she'd wondered if she should say something. But by the time she'd worked up the courage, Michael had already left town. And she'd told herself it probably didn't mean anything anyway. He was maintenance. Maybe Angela had called about something that needed fixing. Maybe it was innocent. But 14 years later, she wasn't so sure. Detectives reopened the case. It took time. Months of work. They had to track Michael Torres down, verify his current address, coordinate with law enforcement in New Mexico. They had to pull the old case file, review every piece of evidence, every interview, every lead that had gone nowhere. They had to build a strategy. And they had to decide if Brenda's testimony was enough. On its own, it wasn't. She'd seen Michael leaving the building. That didn't prove he'd killed Angela. He could have been doing his job. He could have been visiting someone else. He could have had any number of reasons to be there. But combined with the fact that he'd left Houston so suddenly, that he'd refused to answer Robert Dawson's letters, that his alibi from 1989 was vague and unverifiable, it was enough to bring him in for questioning. In January 2004, detectives from the Houston Police Department flew to Albuquerque. They found Michael Torres at a construction site on the north side of the city. He was 42 now, his hair streaked with gray, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. He looked older than his years. They approached him during his lunch break. Showed him their badges. Told him they needed to talk about a case from 1989. Michael's face didn't change. He just nodded. He agreed to come back to Houston. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't seem surprised. It was like he'd been waiting for this. The interview took place on January 14, 2004, in a small room at the Houston Police Department. 2 detectives sat across from Michael Torres. A tape recorder sat on the table between them. They asked him if he remembered Angela Dawson. He said he did. They asked him if he remembered working in her apartment. He said he did. They asked him if he'd been in her apartment the night she died. Michael Torres looked down at his hands. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the detectives started to think he wasn't going to answer. And then he said yes. He said he'd been there. He said he'd stopped by after his shift because he'd seen her light on and wanted to ask if everything was okay with the plumbing in her kitchen. There'd been a complaint from the unit below about water pressure, and he'd wanted to check all the units on that line. He said Angela had let him in. They'd talked for a few minutes. Everything had been fine. And then she'd asked him to leave. He said he didn't know why he hadn't left right away. He said something in him had shifted. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him, polite but distant, the way you look at someone whose name you can't quite remember. Like he wasn't really there. Like he didn't matter. He said he'd been noticing her for months. The way she walked to her car in the mornings, the way she smiled when she said thank you, the way she moved through the world like it was easy. Like everything was easy for her. He said he'd wanted to talk to her. Really talk. Not just about plumbing or smoke detectors, but about real things. He'd imagined conversations they might have. He'd imagined her seeing him as more than just the maintenance man. But she didn't see him that way. And when she'd asked him to leave, politely but firmly, it had felt like a door closing. Like confirmation of something he'd always known but never wanted to admit. He said he'd grabbed her. Not hard at first. Just her arm. Just to make her stop and listen. But she'd pulled away. And something inside him broke. Michael Torres told the detectives that he hadn't meant to kill Angela Dawson. He said it happened fast. He said he'd put his hands on her throat and she'd struggled, but not for long. He said he'd held on until she stopped moving. And then he'd stood there, looking down at her, trying to understand what he'd done. He said he'd left the apartment, locked the door behind him, and gone back to his own unit. He'd taken a shower. He'd sat on the edge of his bed for hours, staring at the wall. He said he'd known he should turn himself in. He'd known it even then. But he didn't. Instead, he'd gone to work the next day. And the day after that. He'd kept his head down, done his job, and waited for the police to come. They'd interviewed him once, but they hadn't arrested him. They'd let him go. And 3 weeks later, he'd quit his job and left Houston. He'd packed his things, loaded up his truck, and driven west until he hit New Mexico. He'd found work in Albuquerque, found a cheap apartment, and tried to forget. But he never did. He said he'd thought about turning himself in 100 times over the years. He'd thought about it every time he saw a police car, every time he heard a siren, every time he passed someone on the street who reminded him of Angela. He'd thought about it on the anniversary of her death, when he'd lie awake at night and wonder if her family had gotten any answers. He said he'd known this day would come eventually. That someone would figure it out. That the past would catch up. He said he was almost relieved. Michael Torres was arrested on January 14, 2004. He was charged with murder. He was held without bail. Robert Dawson got the call 2 days later. He didn't say anything when the detective told him. He just stood there in his kitchen, holding the phone, staring at the binder on the table that he'd been carrying for 15 years. Then he sat down and started to cry. The case didn't go to trial. Michael's attorney, a public defender named Sarah Vega, met with prosecutors and negotiated a plea. Michael didn't want to fight it. He said he was guilty. He said he wanted to take responsibility. In August 2004, 15 years and 5 months after Angela Dawson's death, Michael Torres stood in a Houston courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The judge accepted the plea. Michael was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The courtroom was almost empty that day. A few reporters sat in the back, taking notes. A victim's advocate from the DA's office sat near the front. And in the very first row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, Robert and Linda Dawson sat side by side, holding hands. The judge asked if the victim's family wanted to make a statement. Robert shook his head. He didn't trust himself to speak. Linda stood up instead. She was 70 years old by then, her hair white, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the railing in front of her. She said she wanted Michael Torres to know that he'd taken more than Angela's life. He'd taken 15 years from her family. 15 years of wondering, of not knowing, of living in a kind of suspended grief that never ended because there was no closure. She said she'd spent 15 years unable to let go, unable to move forward, unable to accept that her daughter was gone. She said she forgave him. Not because he deserved it. But because she needed to. And then she sat down. Michael Torres didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor. The judge sentenced him. The bailiffs led him away. And it was over. Robert and Linda walked out of the courthouse together. It was a hot August day, the kind of heat that presses down on Houston like a weight. They stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, blinking in the bright sunlight. A reporter approached and asked if they had any comment. Robert shook his head. He just wanted to go home. Before they left Houston, Robert stopped at a payphone in the courthouse lobby. He called the Houston Chronicle and asked to speak to someone in the classifieds department. He told them he needed to cancel a recurring ad. The one he'd been placing every year for the past 15 years. The woman on the other end of the line asked if he was sure. He said he was. He didn't need it anymore. If you believe Angela Dawson deserved someone to keep pushing for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Because that's exactly what her father did, every single year, every single weekend, through heart attacks and exhaustion and a grief that never really ended, until the truth finally came forward. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give you back the years. It doesn't make the loss any less sharp. But it does mean something. It means the truth was spoken out loud. It means someone was held accountable. It means the person you loved wasn't forgotten. For Robert and Linda Dawson, the resolution didn't bring peace, exactly. But it brought something close. A kind of quiet. A sense that they could finally stop fighting. That they could let Angela rest. Linda changed Angela's bedroom after the sentencing. She packed up the stuffed animals, the posters, the comforter. She didn't throw them away. She put them in boxes and carried them up to the attic. She said it felt like the right time. Like she was finally able to let her daughter go. Robert stopped driving to Houston every weekend. He stopped calling the police department every Monday. He stopped sitting at the kitchen table with his binder, rearranging facts that no longer mattered. He said it felt strange at first. Like he didn't know what to do with himself. The case had been his life for so long that without it, he felt untethered. Lost. But slowly, he started to find other things. He started going to his grandson's baseball games. He started helping Linda in the garden. He started sleeping through the night. He didn't talk about Angela much after that. But she was always there. In the photo on the mantel. In the quiet moments when he'd catch himself thinking about her. In the way he'd stop what he was doing every March 14th and just sit for a while, remembering. Robert Dawson passed away in 2011, 7 years after Michael Torres was convicted. He was 73. His obituary in the Beaumont Enterprise said he was a devoted father, a retired electrician, and a man who never gave up on his daughter. It didn't say how many hours he'd spent on the phone with police. How many miles he'd driven back and forth to Houston. How many nights he'd stayed awake, staring at that binder on the kitchen table, wondering if he'd ever find the answer. But his family knew. And Angela knew. Linda Dawson is still alive. She's 82 now, living in the same house in Beaumont where she and Robert raised Angela. She keeps a photo of her daughter on the mantel, not the one from the news, but a different one. Angela at 25, smiling, standing in front of her first apartment in Houston. The one she'd been so proud of. Linda says she likes that photo better. It's how she wants to remember her daughter. Not as a victim. Not as a case file. But as the young woman who'd called home every Sunday, who'd loved terrible romantic comedies, who'd been figuring out how to live on her own. That's who Angela was. And that's who she should have been allowed to keep being. Houston has changed in the years since Angela Dawson died. The Montrose neighborhood where she lived is different now, more expensive, more crowded, the kind of place where old apartment complexes get torn down and replaced with condos and coffee shops that serve $8 lattes. The building where Angela lived is gone. It was demolished in the late 90s. A new development stands there now. Asterisk, but there's a small park not far from where the building used to be. Just a patch of grass and a few benches, nothing special. Someone, no one's quite sure who, planted a dogwood tree there a few years ago. There's a small plaque at the base. It says, "In memory of Angela Marie Dawson. 1960 to 1989. People walk past it every day. Most don't notice. But some do. And every spring, when the tree blooms, someone leaves flowers at the base. Fresh ones. Different every time. Daisies one week. Roses the next. Linda says it's not her. She doesn't know who it is. But she's grateful. Because it means someone else is remembering too. Brenda Ochoa, the woman who finally came forward after 14 years, never spoke publicly about the case after her initial statement to police. But in the years that followed, she became quietly involved in victim advocacy work. She volunteered at a crisis center in Houston, answering phones, sitting with families who were waiting for answers the way Angela's family had waited. She told a friend once that she couldn't undo her silence. Couldn't give those 14 years back. But maybe she could help someone else find their voice sooner. She said she thought about Angela sometimes. About what might have been different if she'd spoken up right away. If she'd called the police the morning after she'd seen Michael leaving the apartment. The friend told her there was no way to know. That she'd done the right thing in the end. That her testimony had mattered. But you can hear the weight in that, can't you? The years of wondering. The guilt that doesn't go away just because you finally did something. Brenda carried that. And maybe she still does. Kyle Brennan, Angela's boyfriend at the time of her death, was never charged with anything. He'd moved to Austin in the early 90s, remarried, started a family. When reporters reached out to him after Michael Torres's arrest, he declined to comment. A neighbor said he'd seemed surprised. That he'd had no idea the case had been solved. Sometimes the people we suspect are exactly who we think they are. And sometimes they're not. The Houston Police Department acknowledged that mistakes had been made in the original investigation. Michael Torres should have been interviewed more thoroughly. His alibi should have been verified more carefully. His sudden departure from Houston should have raised more red flags. But in 1989, the department was overwhelmed. Homicides in Houston had spiked. Detectives were handling multiple cases at once. Resources were stretched thin. Angela's case was one of many, and without physical evidence, without a clear suspect, it had fallen through the cracks. That's not an excuse. But it is the reality. And it's a reality that shaped how Angela's case was handled. How long it took. How close it came to never being solved at all. What saved it, in the end, wasn't forensic science. It wasn't a new technique or a technological breakthrough. It was something much simpler, and much more human. It was a father who refused to stop looking. And a witness who finally found the courage to speak. That combination, persistence and conscience, is what brought Michael Torres back to Houston. What put him in that interview room? What forced him to finally say the words he'd been carrying for 15 years? You think about that, and you realize how fragile justice really is. How easily it could have gone the other way. If Robert Dawson had given up after 5 years, after 10 years. If Brenda Ochoa had talked herself out of making that call one more time. If Michael Torres had refused to come back to Houston, if he'd asked for a lawyer, if he'd stayed silent. But they didn't. And in 2004, 15 years late, Angela Dawson finally got her answer. Michael Torres will be eligible for parole in 2034. He'll be 72 years old. By then, Angela's parents will almost certainly be gone. The reporters who covered the case will have moved on. The detectives who worked it will have retired. The city will have changed again, grown again, become something different. But someone will remember. Someone always does. The years between 1989 and 2004 weren't empty for the Dawsons. They lived their lives. They went to work. They celebrated holidays with family. They watched their grandson grow up. They grieved other losses. But underneath all of it, there was always Angela. Always the question. Always the not knowing. And then, finally, there was knowing. Linda said in a rare interview a few years after the case was resolved that the knowing was harder than she'd expected. That she'd spent so long imagining what had happened, building theories in her mind, wondering, that the truth felt almost anticlimactic. A maintenance man. A moment of impulse. A death that didn't need to happen. She said she'd thought the answer would make everything make sense. But it didn't. It just gave her something concrete to be angry about. And maybe that's better than nothing. Maybe that's all closure ever really is. Stories like Angela's don't end cleanly. They don't wrap up with a bow. The bad guy goes to prison, yes. The family gets answers, yes. But the loss doesn't go away. The years don't come back. The life that should have been lived stays unlived. You're left with the truth, which is both everything and not enough. But here's what else is true: the fight mattered. The refusal to let go mattered. The small, stubborn acts of remembering, the newspaper notices, the phone calls, the weekend drives to Houston, the knock on every door, those mattered. They didn't bring Angela back. But they brought Michael Torres to justice. And they made sure Angela's name didn't disappear. In a world where so many names do disappear, where so many cases go cold and stay cold, that's not nothing. That's something. If you think about your own life, the routines you have, the small rituals that make up your days, you realize how much we take for granted. How easily it could all be interrupted. How quickly ordinary can turn into unimaginable. Angela Dawson was living an ordinary life. She was 29 years old. She was building a career. She was figuring herself out. She had plans for the weekend. She had milk in her fridge that needed to be put away. She had her whole life ahead of her. And then she didn't. Her story is a reminder that justice is never guaranteed. That it requires people who care enough to keep pushing. That it requires witnesses who finally find the courage to speak. That it requires time, patience, and a willingness to believe that the truth matters, even when it takes 15 years to come forward. It also requires you. The person listening. The person who stays until the end, who doesn't look away, who believes these stories matter even when they're difficult. Because they do matter. And so did Angela. The question isn't whether we can prevent every tragedy. We can't. The question is whether we'll remember the people those tragedies took from us. Whether we'll keep their names alive. Whether we'll keep fighting for answers even when it feels hopeless. Robert Dawson did that for 15 years. And because he did, Angela's case didn't stay unsolved. You think about that, about the kind of love it takes to keep fighting when everyone else has moved on. The kind of determination it takes to place the same ad in the newspaper every year for 15 years, knowing that most years, no one will call. The kind of faith it takes to believe that the truth is still out there, waiting, and that someone just has to care enough to find it. That's what solved Angela's case. Not science. Not luck. Just love. And stubbornness. And the refusal to forget. These stories ask something of us. They ask us to sit with discomfort. To confront the reality that bad things happen to good people, and that justice is slow, and that answers don't always bring peace. But they also ask us to remember. To bear witness. To make sure the people who were lost aren't forgotten. And if you stayed to the end, if you've been sitting here listening to Angela's story for the past 40-some minutes, then you're already doing that. You're already part of the reason stories like this don't disappear. So thank you. Angela Dawson deserved better than what happened to her in that apartment in March of 1989. She deserved to live the life she was building. She deserved to keep making plans, keep figuring things out, keep calling her mother every Sunday. She deserved to turn 30, 40, 50. She deserved to fall in love, to travel, to make mistakes and learn from them, to grow old. She didn't get that. But she did get someone who refused to let her be forgotten. Someone who fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. Someone who believed she mattered enough to spend 15 years demanding answers. And in the end, that made all the difference. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.